Okay, so have you ever opened your closet and it's just overflowing with clothes? And you're like, oh my gosh, I never wear half of this stuff.
Right.
It's like wasted space, right?
Yeah.
Well, businesses deal with the same thing, but instead of old clothes, it's products. And it can have some serious costs that most people don't think about.
Yeah.
So that's what we're diving into today, the hidden costs of inventory. Thankfully, we have a couple of videos by supply chain expert Ian Johnson to help us break this down. And he talks about something called inventory carrying costs, which basically means how much it costs a business to hold on to all that unsold stuff.
Yeah, and I think it's a really good point that these costs are they are hidden, right? Like
Sure.
companies focus a lot on the cost of buying the inventory in the first place, but what happens after that is sometimes kind of not as front of mind.
Exactly. So it's not just the cost of like buying the product, it's the cost of storing it, right?
Right. And it's even more than that too. So Johnson in the video, he talks about all these different factors. Like one of them is the cost of capital.
Okay, now, cost of capital, that sounds very financialist. What does that actually mean for like a normal person?
Yeah. So basically, every dollar that you have spent on inventory is a dollar that you no longer have available to, for example, invest in something else in your business or save or anything like that.
So it's a lost opportunity.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a lost opportunity. So it's not just the cost of the warehouse, although that is a factor. It's also just like, what else could you be doing with that money?
And then on top of that, you've got like, you got to think about insurance, potential damage, even just things becoming like old and obsolete.
Yeah, that obsolescence risk is huge, right? Like he gives the example in the video of like, let's say you're sitting on all of this inventory of like last season's smartphones.
Oh, yeah.
And then the new iPhone comes out or whatever it is.
Right.
And suddenly what you have, that inventory, is worth like a fraction of what you paid for it.
Ouch. Yeah, that's going to hurt.
Yeah, that's a real cost. And he actually says in the video that on average, companies can expect to pay something like 2 to 3% of the inventory's value every month.
Wait, 2 to 3% every single month?
Yeah,
That's like if you have a 10% profit margin, you could be wiping out a third of your profits just by holding on to stuff.
exactly.
Wow.
Yeah, and it becomes even more concrete when you think about the actual space that this inventory is taking up,
Huh?
right? Like he talks about this company, and they have a 100,000 square foot warehouse.
100,000 square feet. That's like, I can't even imagine. That's huge. So when you start to think about all these carrying costs and you factor that in, what does that actually look like for a space that big?
Well, they actually did the math, and it turns out that they were spending $3.60 per square foot.
360 a square foot.
Yeah.
Just to have stuff in there.
Yeah, just in carrying costs.
That's like prime real estate for cardboard boxes. So like suddenly, when you think about it like that, expanding your warehouse doesn't sound like such a great idea.
No, it definitely makes you think twice, right? It's like, okay, what's actually in these boxes and is it worth it? And I think it goes back to like the analogy you were making before with like your closet. Like, there are some things that, yeah, it's worth it to pay to store them. Maybe
Yeah.
it's like, that nice jacket that you break out for special occasions.
Hmm.
But then there's other stuff where you're like, why am I keeping this?
Right. Like those old T-shirts, I'm never going to wear them again. But
Exactly. Yeah. For some reason, I'm hanging on to them.
yeah, and those are taking up space, right?
Yeah.
So in a business context, every square foot is, it's costing you money potentially.
Yeah. So what would you say, like, what's the solution then? How do you get out of this, like, inventory carrying cost trap? Well, I think it's about being, I think strategic is probably the word. Understanding that these hidden costs exist, and then making decisions accordingly, right?
Right.
So maybe that means, being a little bit more careful about what you're ordering in the first place. Maybe, you get a big discount if you order a whole bunch of something, but then you realize that actually, that's going to cost me a lot in carrying costs.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe I'm better off, ordering less more frequently or something like that.
It's like that old saying, like, sometimes less is more, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And especially when you think about the fact that, like, this is just one half of, like, the inventory cost equation, right? There's, like, the cost of having too much, but then there's also the cost of not having enough.
That's right. Yeah. So we've been talking about, what happens when you have too much inventory. But of course, the flip side of that is like, What happens when you don't have enough and you're running out of stuff?
Which, like, as a customer, I know that can be so frustrating when you're, like, trying to buy something and it's out of stock and you're like, ugh.
Yeah, it's super frustrating. And for the business, it's lost revenue, right? Like you want to be able to sell your products, and if you don't have them, you can't do that.
Yeah, makes sense.
But what I thought was really interesting, Johnson, in his second video, he actually goes into this idea of, like, what are the costs of not having enough inventory?
Hmm.
He kind of lays out this scenario where he's like, imagine that you have a really important customer and they need a product, like, right now.
Oh, okay. I can see, like, the beads of sweat start to form on the business owner's brow. It's like,
Exactly. And, what are they going to do? So they're going to have to, like, expedite the shipping, maybe.
yeah.
Maybe they have to, like, rush production, which means, like, paying their workers overtime, things like that.
Even those rush orders, man, they always cost, like, an arm and a leg.
Yeah, you're totally right. You end up paying a premium for sure. And it's not just the immediate cost either.
Yeah.
Think about what it does to your relationships with customers if you can never deliver on time.
Yeah. You start to lose that trust.
Exactly. They might start looking for other places to do business, places that can actually meet their needs. That long-term cost, man, that's tough to bounce back from.
That's a really good point. So it's like this balancing act, right? Like, you don't want to have too much inventory, but you also don't want to have too little. So how do you find that sweet spot? How do businesses figure out, like, okay, this is the right amount of inventory to have on hand?
It's definitely a challenge. And honestly, I don't think there's any, like, magic formula that works for everyone. But it starts with good planning.
Yep.
And being able to forecast, like, what you anticipate your needs are going to be. And it also means really understanding your customers' buying habits. Like, what are the patterns? What are they likely to order and when?
So to bring it back to that warehouse example, it's about making sure that those square feet, they're not just being used to store stuff, they're being used strategically.
100%. It's like, if those boxes could talk, you want them to be saying, get me out of here. I'm ready to be sold.
Exactly. Get those products moving.
Right. Keep that inventory flowing. What's interesting about all this is this idea of finding a balance between too much and too little.
Yeah.
It applies to so much more than just business. It's really relevant to life in general,
Oh, totally. I see it all the time.
Like, take your schedule, for example. If you overcommit yourself, you've got too much on your plate, you're carrying all that weight around, kind of like a warehouse full of stuff you don't need.
It's so true. I feel like I'm always in that position where I'm like, why did I say yes to all of this?
Right. And then on the flip side, if your schedule's wide open and you're not really doing much, you might find yourself scrambling last minute trying to make things happen, like those rush fees we were talking about. It's all about finding that balance.
It's like this episode, we're wrapping it up perfectly. We've learned so much about inventory costs and how important it is to find that balance between too much and too little. And I love how you brought it back to our everyday lives. It's not just about business. It's about managing our time, our resources, even just our stuff, right?
100%, yeah. At the end of the day, it's about being mindful and making conscious choices about how we're using what we have.
This deep dive has been amazing. Thanks so much for joining me. Until next time.